Continuing into part 3 of chapter 6, talking about deviance, I just talked about functionalism and deviance. Let's move on to symbolic interactionism and theories of deviance. Symbolic interaction being one of the big three. Here we have Harold Bloomer, who has coined the term symbolic interactionism. Here it looks at the ways in which interactions are reflective of some larger or more important theory. Under this heading, we might have something like labeling theory, where labels that are attached to individuals become, in effect, self-fulfilling prophecies, that they constrain individual behavior or otherwise limit individuals or provide individuals with broadened horizons. The idea is that these labels will have some sort of impact when it comes to establishing self-identity of the individual. In that particular context, Beckers argues that social groups establish what constitutes deviance. They set up what's wrong, and they're the ones who ultimately issue the punishment in the form of labeling of a wrongdoer as an outsider. In a sense, the label ends up creating the individual rather than the other way around. I think Becker ends up dividing up deviance into primary and secondary categories, where the primary deviance would be the form of rule breaking that happens, and that secondary would be the behaviors that spring out of an individual once that individual has been given a particular label. That in effect, that label so prevents others from being able to interpret behavior outside of anything but what the label says, that the person ends up feeling somewhat constrained by it. The classic example is the Stanford prison experiment, which I've mentioned before, talking about individuals who are assigned arbitrarily the idea of a prisoner or a guard, and how that leads to a change in behavior. The experiences of the U.S. military at the Abu Ghraib facility in Iraq also seems to be a pretty good example of labeling, on how you can end up treating individuals in a particular way because you've labeled them as in some sort of negative fashion that would therefore justify any consequential behavior. This could end up leading or producing the so-called Lucifer effect. Zimbardo was the one that suggests that good people can do terrible things under certain types of circumstances. We also see that labeling could end up being stigmatizing, which leads to a change of a person's sense of social identity, or that it is so negative as to suggest that really an individual is caught in a permanent status change. Look at how, for example, people who might be regarded as suffering from mental illness, and how that's a stigmatizing designation, or even more formally how our society would, once a person has been determined to be criminal, might end up changing or removing certain types of options. In terms of symbolic interactionism, when you look at the broken windows theory of deviance, you see a way in which those broken windows convey a message to the community. One of the impacts of that particular type of research was that it was not so much that the broken windows were a problem, but that the broken windows represented a kind of a deviance being present, that having broken windows and seeing them go unaddressed for a long period of time suggested that this was no longer a place that was being monitored, and therefore it practically invited individuals to engage in criminal behavior. Or at least that's how the theory would end up doing it. Zimbardo did an experiment separate from broken windows, where he and his fellow researchers studied how an abandoned car would be treated in certain types of neighborhoods. And what they found, regardless of the neighborhood, was that cars might be treated in a certain manner that didn't seem disrespectful to the ownership of the property, but that once some sort of damage took place towards the vehicle, then pretty quickly people in the community ended up similarly degrading the quality of the vehicle. Switching over from symbolic interactionism, let's consider the idea of crime itself. This is a formal type of deviance. It is involving punishment. The process recognizes that this is more serious, so that before we are able to impose a punishment on an individual, we'll end up needing to see that some sort of procedures have been followed, that punishment is available only after prosecution has shown beyond a reasonable doubt enough evidence on each of the component pieces of the crime so as to be able to justify conviction and subsequent treatment. Look at the difference between crime and street crime, where what you might end up seeing is that this is crime committed in public. The broken windows example and theory shows how that could be a street crime because of what it conveys to the public. It also can end up describing how crime can occur behind closed doors and how the public would not have any real sense of this or would not feel any change of behavior. Cloward Nolans comes up with a differential opportunity theory, talks about the ways in which, even in the face of legitimate economic structures, illegitimate opportunities exist and are distributed unequally in a particular society. What this ends up meaning is that you could end up affecting crime rates by being able to go after or expend resources in a particular neighborhood when a particular set of behavioral patterns is more extreme there than elsewhere. What would also help the community is meaning that you could take certain measures that would anticipate the risk of criminality occurring so as to be able to to decrease the likelihood of certain types of crimes occurring. Contrast street crime with the idea of so-called white-collar crime, and simply the idea of white-collar crime would be that it presumes that people who would dress like I currently do in class with a white business shirt would engage in certain kinds of criminal behavior. The concept, first labeled as such by Edwin Sutherland, basically talks about the way in which we see property-based crimes happening, and that these are crimes that flow out of or are a function of individuals having achieved a particular kind of status. A typical or common way to look at these kinds of offenses is to consider them as corporate crimes. Yes, it's true corporations would be the ones that potentially would commit them, but it would be through the actions of their so-called white-collar employees who ended up doing something like that. When you look at what's unusual there is that you're seeing more of a managerial segment of the population. In some context, you might even consider these people to be elites, and yet that a certain environment can arise that they end up doing things that they know pretty clearly are illegal, and yet sort of get caught up in the moment. The most recent high-profile classic example is of the investment advisor Bernie Madoff, and how he ended up running a scheme for many years where it seemed like he was able consistently to produce certain kinds of returns on investments for clients, and what actually he was doing was a Ponzi scheme or a pyramid scheme, so that as people would bring new money in, he would tap that money and go and pay off older investors who had received promises of high returns. In the context of crime, Erickson suggests that the idea of deviance may change through history, both in terms of who would the victims be and who would be the ones engaging in a particular activity, but that, as I'd started off the discussion of Chapter 6, would indicate that in all instances you still have deviance. What do you end up doing to these kinds of unacceptable behaviors? That's a question that is hopefully addressed through the idea of crime reduction. Some of the approaches could include the use of deterrence. The idea of deterrence presumes that people are rational calculators, a phrase that I've used in prior discussions. Rational here does not mean as a term that is contrasted, say, with insanity, but rational means in terms of a process of careful evaluation, so that by weighing all criteria, the individual will choose that course of action which will yield the greatest benefit for that particular individual. That being known, therefore, if people are rational calculators, how can you end up shaping their behavior when it comes to crimes? And you can do this through the idea of punishment. If you punish an individual for having engaged in criminal behavior, you've ended up punishing this person using specific deterrence. That punishment was sent as a message to this individual that if the individual does something again, he or she is going to get the same kind of punishment. But the act of punishing an individual can also lead to general deterrence, where the punishments that are administered to a specific individual can be held out as an example to others and a warning that if they do as this particular individual does, they also will end up suffering a penalty from it. Part of the difficulty in being able to see deterrence work very effectively in our society is that since it involves the modification of behavior modification seems strongest when the punishment is administered close in time to the aberrant behavior. The difficulty with achieving that in our legal system has to do with our system of rights, where on the one hand, deterrence would require quick assessment and then punishment. Our rights-based system creates obstacles from that to happen, something that was part of the deliberate design of the framers of the Constitution. And from their perspective, they wanted to guard against an overly intrusive government. So they created this kind of obstacle course to weaken the ability of prosecution to be able to go after individuals successfully and punish them for the commission of certain types of crimes. How do you know that deterrence is working? One measurement of success or failure would be the concept of recidivism. That is, the rate at which individuals become repeat offenders. It's pretty clear that even for a first-time offender, not all first-time offenders become second-time offenders. Some don't re-offend. And that process continues until you get a very small population. Usually it correlates to age, so that by the time you're seeing individuals in their late 20s or early 30s, you're talking a relatively small segment of the overall population. Perhaps whether it's because of learning in general some of the problems of consequences or sort of mellowing that comes with age, recidivism rates do seem to drop off pretty dramatically in individuals the further along you go. To the extent that we end up using punishment to reduce crime, we might end up seeing the use of total institutions, a concept that was advanced by Goffman. And the idea here is that you break down the barriers of the individual to be able to reshape the individual to mold that person into a law-abiding citizen. So Goffman's idea of a total institution includes management of sleep, work, and play, that level of control could be enough to be able to get people to act differently. Consider Michel Foucault's presentation on the nature of punishment. He ends up suggesting that if you characterize punishment before our modern era, that it ended up being primarily physical, and that the punishment befell a particular body. Often the punishment would be in somehow a reflection of the particular crime. So you might have someone who ends up making a false statement, losing his or her tongue because of making such a false statement as a way of directing the punishment towards the organ that was responsible for the crime, which sounds pretty morbid. But then again, the idea of this kind of punishment is, and it seems kind of strange or counterintuitive to say this, but it is of proportionality. There's a concept in criminal justice known as lex talionis, or an eye for an eye. And the principle, which you can find references to in the Bible as well as in the Code of Hammurabi, which goes back several thousands of years, suggests that punishment be proportional, so that if someone's eye is knocked out, that person's eye has to be knocked out. That would be an equal and appropriate level of punishment. One variation on this theme is to suggest that this kind of punishment is actually an evolution in punishment, because it would be proportionate, that previous to a particular time when you saw the acceptance of proportional punishment, you might very well have seen a response to the actions of an individual that would seem disproportionate, so that if someone kills a member of your tribe, your tribe ends up rallying together and wiping out not just that person, but all of the people in that person's tribe. So in that way, lex talionis is an improvement. And if you're going to want to stick with biblical sources, lex talionis shows up in the Old Testament. But when you consider the actions of the prophet in the New Testament, who ends up saying the appropriate response to certain insults, if you will, certain crimes, is to turn the other cheek, to forgive. Modern punishment shifts away from trying to punish the body and aims to rehabilitate the soul being that fiction associated commonly with Christian faiths that serves as a surrogate to represent the individual, so that once we understand the nature of the soul involved, we'll end up being able to make adjustments to that individual. What you see here is the concept, once again, of rehabilitation, of trying to reclaim the individual who's otherwise been lost. Ways in which you end up seeing punishment, according to Foucault, would include disciplinary techniques about monitoring, so that the intrusion has to deal more with psychology rather than necessarily physical injury, and that it could in fact be more effective. The typical example that's held out of the way in which monitoring can reshape behavior is the institution known as the panopticon, which is something that the noted criminologist Jeremy Bentham suggested, a type of facility where the guards would be able to keep track of the inmates fairly easily. You might have glass between the cells or the floors, which would allow the guards to be able to see what's going on rather easily. You get an example in your book where you see this kind of pylon or structure where the guards are going to have enough height and therefore perspective to be able to look into cells. And so from Foucault's perspective, more effective punishment is more psychological in nature, creating the sort of impression that individuals are being monitored. If we've talked about the concepts associated with punishment, consider how punishment is a function of criminal justice in this particular country. We've already seen that rehabilitation is an important element. The regaining of an individual, the recognition that once certain conditions are being met, an individual is considered rehabilitated and can rejoin society, having, so to speak, paid his or her debt associated with having committed the crimes. But we'll also see in the American criminal justice theories and philosophies an approach relating to punishment. So while rehabilitation will be looking forward to having an individual rejoin society to be productive, punishment is backward looking. It is a reaction only to the crime with little regard for the future. Of course, that sort of falls apart when you start to blend in deterrence, since that also is future looking. What happens when we have this system in place and what seems to be neutral is not? When you look at the dramatic increase of the prison populations over the past few decades, partly in response to the so-called war on drugs, you've seen that disproportionate representation in certain groups. So relative to their overall population, you see more black men and Latinos in prison than you would see white men in prisons. And so it raises the larger issue of a punishment system that might be fair on its face, but produces a negative effect. And so the question is, do you consider with that particular kind of system? Or do you end up deciding that you need to tear everything down and restart it? I suspect that is a somewhat extreme view in the eyes of those who are in a particular community. The consequences of having so many black men and Latinos in prison means that you see a weakening of social cohesion in a particular neighborhood. What may have accelerated the process has been the loss of the kinds of jobs that you would often see those particular types of individuals working in. But you end up seeing more single-parent families as a result of this, more of a sense of disconnection that's going on between the individual who's been incarcerated and family members. In fact, the war on drugs might have been a good example of how punishment turned out to be not such a good idea. The so-called Rockefeller laws were enacted in the early 1970s as a way to use greater punishment to discourage individuals from engaging in drug-related offenses. All this seems to have done is jacked up the populations of people in prisons. It doesn't seem to have had a material impact on drug sales, illegal drug sales. And as a result, the general thinking has been that whatever the label that's applied to it, it doesn't seem very likely that it'll succeed, maybe begging the larger question of perhaps even legalizing some of the inappropriate substances at this point in time. So that's all I have to say for Chapter 6 for Part 3. Let me end it here, and if I don't see you in class soon enough, I'll have more for you available on these video lectures.